We are in the final week of Season 1 for this podcast. And by Season 1, I mean today is episode number 360. We have covered a lot of ground over the year, but I have to admit that going in, I did not think airline incidents would play this much of a role. Hi, I'm Chris May, writer, producer, and host of This Day in Weather History, a podcast from the Weather Network in Canada, and only 1 week away from our first anniversary. Today we go back into what are supposed to be the friendly skies. This day in weather history. Today we look at the curious case of a BMI Airbus bound for Cyprus from Manchester, England. This chartered holiday flight had stopped over for a routine refueling in Cyprus. Then after that, 1 hour, what they call a turnaround, they departed again for their final destination, Manchester. They got up into the air, and after a short while, everything went wrong. The flight hit a powerfully turbulent storm over Germany 90 minutes before it was due to land. But this was all weather-related this time, and today's story is the first this year where human error played no role. Rather, the crew were praised for saving all lives on board. More on that coming up. A spokesperson for the airline later said that while the aircraft was badly damaged, none of its operational systems were affected. That might have been the saving grace because outside the body of this craft, that was not the case. The pilot's window was cracked by the large hailstones. Good Lord, how big were those hailstones? The plane flying through the storm was in the towering cloud formation, cumulus formation that was fueled by intense updraft. This took water droplets that were likely churning around inside this monster cell and fused them together to create the same massive ice formations that, when they eventually hit the ground, are still golf ball to baseball sized. But this plane was in the belly of the beast, where the supercooled water droplets were at their most impressive. The plane pitched and rolled violently as it ran into the severe intercloud turbulence, with huge hailstones pounding its exterior. One passenger said that it felt like they were suffering a showering of bullets, and then came a mighty thump. At that point, everyone was screaming. Remember that this day in weather history can be enjoyed a number of ways. Right now, you are listening to the full version of today's story on your favorite podcast provider, but there is also the daily podcast video short. They are shot right here in my podcast recording studio, so you get that perspective, and oftentimes they will include visuals from that day's event from when it happened in weather history. So after listening to the full story, go check out the podcast video short on television or online anytime at theweathernetwork.com/weather history. Right, people screaming. Let's pick it up. Thrown to the ceiling, chucked to the floors, they feared for their lives as the plane was caught in this heavy turbulence. But here's where I mentioned earlier that the crew were praised for their efforts. Passengers said that the crew had everything under control, and none of the 213 passengers or 8 crew members was seriously hurt. It was not until they were disembarked on the tarmac when they turned to see a football, or this is in Manchester, I guess soccer ball-sized hole, punched out of the plane's exterior. Come on, man, that's incredible. What happened? The aircraft was initially cleared to climb to 8,000 feet, but before reaching that altitude and prior to this, the aircraft had been in clear skies above this towering cumulus cloud formation that I pointed out earlier. It was clear for most of the flight until that final 90 minutes over Germany. When they entered a patch of high-altitude cirrus cloud, that's when the fasten seatbelt sign was turned back on in anticipation for, and I quote, an area of light innocuous turbulence. Boy, that was an understatement. Approximately 20 seconds later, however, the turbulence increased from moderate to severe. The autopilot setting disconnected, and the aircraft climbed rapidly above its assigned level. That's when the intense hail began to strike the aircraft. Both flight crew later said that although they both noticed that the master warning light had turned on when the autopilot disconnected, they have no idea how long it was on for because neither pilot could hear it over the associated noise that was coming from the hail. I can only imagine the immensity of those hailstones that hit this plane this day in weather history. Tomorrow is May 27th, and it is episode number 361. With only 5 more days to go until our first anniversary, we are looking ahead to some amazing stories still this year. We have the Barrie tornado of '85, the 1948 Oregon flood where a whole city disappeared, and a shipwreck with a most unusual circumstance surrounding how it sank. Tomorrow is the 27th, as I'd mentioned, and we're going to look at just how close Toronto Island came to disappearing. That's tomorrow on This Day in Weather History with me, your host, Chris May.